Good afternoon, beautiful peoples. Recorded by Richter here, back with another review and music history segment. It's kind of a little bit of both on this one. I made a video on the early years of Pink Floyd about a few months ago now, and I promised that I would get back with more of that as I went along through the book. The book that I'm speaking about is a book called Comfortably Numb by Mark Blake. He's the author of the audiobook that I've been listening to about the history of Pink Floyd as I go through their catalog in order and listen to it. And in the first video, I talked about their first 5 albums and my thoughts on it. And when I went back and watched it, I was thinking in my head, I need to start approaching this as if people are just hearing about Pink Floyd for the very first time. So I wanted to go back and read the personnel off because I forgot to do that in the beginning. So I wanted to make sure everybody knew everybody that was in the band. So I was able to make things a little bit more clearly as I unpacked their history. So for the personnel of the band, you had Syd Barrett, who was the lead vocalist and guitar player in the early years, but that was only for the first album and bits of the second album. As I alluded to in the first one, Syd Barrett had a lot of struggles with drugs and also mental disorders. He was diagnosed later in life as schizophrenic, and so that would start to play into his life after the first one, and he struggled throughout. And he would pop in and check on the guys. Sometimes he would pop in the studio randomly, sometimes he would show up at their shows, but it was really only the first album that he had a big deal or a big part of creating. And then you had Richard Wright, who was one of the songwriters, but also lead keyboards and pianos. You had Nick Mason, who was mostly just the drums and percussion. He didn't do much songwriting other than his drum parts and stuff. And then you had the 2 heavy hitters, the last, but certainly not least here. You had Roger Waters, who was one of the lead songwriters and bass and vocals. And then after the first album, they would hire a friend of theirs who was familiar with all these guys. So like he was friends with Syd Barrett and Richard and Nick and Roger, but he didn't join the band till their second album. And that would be David Gilmour, who ended up being their lead guitarist, lead vocalist, and lead songwriter for the rest of their history. So I wanted to get that out of the way so that way I could unpack. I talked about how in their first 5 albums, I wasn't a gigantic fan of it. I loved some of the ideas, I loved bits of it, I loved the direction of where they were taking their stuff, but I have always had the assumption that the first 5 albums kind of like served as artist development, and they would use the skills that they honed in those years to really write and put out some of the most creative music we've ever heard in popular music. And so I wrote down a few things that I wanted. A quote here, I think, that was from Roger Waters, where he said, Adam Heartmother, which was the album previous to this, Adam Heartmother was the beginning of the end. Meddle was a fresh start. And I was so happy to hear that quote when I was going through Mark's book, because that's how I felt. I felt like Adam Heartmother was the beginning of the end of what they were doing before. And now with Meddle, even though it wasn't all the way there yet to their full potential, it definitely had more song structure and actual things that you could package as a song to sell. Whereas before, I feel like a lot of it was soundscaping and just like experimentation and seeing what they were capable of. So Meddle, I kind of wrote a review and I wanted to read it off to you. Normally I would just speak off the top of my head, but I actually took my time with this one and wrote a review that I would like to raffle off here. So on track 1 on Meddle, you start with the song called One of These Days, which is an instrumental track. And this is when all the soundscaping that the band would be playing with prior to this would pay off for them, because it starts with the sound of the wind blowing, and you could think, oh, here we go again with the more of the same of what they did do. But right when your brain arrives at that, you get this thumping, driving bass note by Roger Waters in the right speaker, and it really kicks the shit into gear and pans over to the left speaker, which is fun if you have some good headphones on, because they like to play with that. It's nothing fancy, just a repetitive note, while swirling guitar sounds from Gilmour start with an effect that hits almost like the sound of a samurai sword cutting through the air. The This continues for measures until you hear the beat of Nick Mason's drums kick as crunchy, distorted guitars come through almost as quickly as it goes out, leaving nothing but a punishing sound reverberating through. As you hear gentle soundscapes, I'm assuming are played by Richard on the keyboards, and then finally you hear muffled vocals peaking, and then boom, full band rocking out with a welcome up-tempo groove. Guitars swirling and wailing until ultimately fades back into sounds of wind blowing and transitions seamlessly into song 2, which is called A Pillow in the Winds. As the sounds of wind subside, you hear a pretty and slow-paced guitar kick in. Then you also hear a second guitar layered in, playing some slide guitar licks by Gilmour's, and his dreamy voice kind of comes through with this spacey, universal type lyrics. This is kind of how Pink Floyd's lyrics up until this point always consisted of. They were kind of like spacey, obscured, artsy, cosmic psychedelia themes. And I think that's when this album is probably the last time you get that. And I think the band was starting to be tired of this. I think Roger Waters specifically wanted to do stuff that had more meaning. And what are we really saying? What's the messaging we're getting through? And this is something that I talk about constantly on this channel and on my podcast, is messaging. I'm a giant hip hop fan, and messaging is really important to me. What are you saying in your music that can be useful to your audience? So that song goes on into that dreamy like state, and the tune at the end sort of fades and comes back into song 3, which is Fearless. And in my opinion, this is the band's first great song with this formation of the band, with Gilmour in it. Fearless is an actual song that I think you could market, and I think it has been pretty popularized in movies and stuff throughout the years. I say that it's one of their first great songs because the opening guitar part is very memorable piece of Pink Floyd's music. Fairly certain song has been featured in lots of things throughout the years, like I was just saying, and the tune would play thematically as a song conquering your inner fears and worries, which is starting to give you that messaging that I was just talking about. That's something that the audience can use. But then after that, you have the song ends with the sounds of a soccer chant or a soccer match, and then it goes into Saint-Tropez, which I love. Saint-Tropez. Saint-Tropez is this really chill, laid back, some parts jazz, some parts surf rock type of song. It's the only song on this album entirely written by Roger Waters, and it's just a really beach-friendly, sunbathing type of record, but it's just so good. It's such a good little groove to it. And I think the song was actually inspired by vacationing with his wife, Nick Mason, and his wife in France a year prior to this album coming out, when the band was there to do a music festival. It definitely has that kind of like it's reminiscent of Sleepwalk by Santo and Johnny in a sense, if you've ever heard that song. Very popular steel slide guitar part. But after you get that song, you arrive at track 5, which is Seamus. And this Seamus song is my least favorite one on the album. It only plays, I don't know, it's kind of like you hear it's like David Gilmour sitting on his front porch with his dog just playing an acoustic guitar. That's very much the vibe of it. You even hear the dog barking along with him as he's singing and playing guitar. It almost plays more like an interlude than an actual song. So I won't say too much about that, but then I will read what I wrote about the final song on the album. Finally, we reached the climactic finale of the album, the 23.5-minute epic called Echoes. Now, for context, this song has been in the works for Pink Floyd for some time now at this point. They had been developing the song in their live shows in different variation for years prior to recording the album. An interesting observation I'd like to point out is it almost feels like a continuation of track 1 in the art direction and general vibe. Much like how One of These Days starts with the repeating bass note, Echoes starts with a repeating, haunting, high piano note. Then after a series of notes of bending guitar from Gilmour enters the picture, followed by some beautiful bass tones from Roger Waters. Finally, the crash of Mason's drums come in, and boom, full band is playing, and you get this grand sound. By the time Gilmour's singing comes in, it's very dreamlike, and the song builds in a sort of crescendos as each time the melody repeats, and it gets a bigger and bigger sound leading into Gilmour rocking out and giving some brilliant layered guitar solos. I would also like to highlight Mason's drumming on this track. They both go off together, and then all of a sudden all the noise cuts out in this slow, funky groove as Gilmour pulls back and then comes in with Wright also grooving on an organ. This funky groove will go on for several minutes with Gilmour tossing crunchy guitar licks over top. Around the 11-minute mark, the whole melody seems like it's sucked into a vacuum or a vortex, as you're left with just the sound of the feedback and swirly space noises, almost to feel like you're falling into a void. When Gilmour comes back in with this strange part, it's almost like to mimic the sound of seagulls in a sense. I think he does this with distortion and toggling the pickup switch on his guitar. It then leads back in with that same high piano note from the beginning of the song, led by the light drumming and cymbals. It eventually builds back up until it repeats the final verse and has this big rhyme rock out climax of an ending. That's kind of what I love about Pink Floyd is they were never afraid to go outside of pop standards. They didn't conform to song structure or bridge, chorus, you know what I mean? Bridge, hook, bridge, chorus. They would do these crazy things. They often were known for not putting their name on the album covers. So they were kind of elusive in a sense. And I did a video on Kendrick Lamar recently about how he doesn't conform to that kind of thing either, and how he uses his artistic freedoms. And I feel like that's what I love about Pink Floyd too, is you didn't see them much. Rock critics actually didn't like them because they weren't giving all the interviews like the rest of the bands were at the same time. So Meddle, I think, to me, is where Pink Floyd starts to be taken seriously from a listening standpoint for me. And then what's to come next is going to be talked about here more. We got Dark Side of the Moon and so on. So I'm definitely going to be back here to cut more parts on their history and review some of their albums. But that's what I got for Meddle. That's what I got for today. Go Lions. Peace.